Thanks everyone very much for joining us and welcome. Just going to keep admitting people as they join us. Welcome to today's event. Just to introduce myself, I'm Chloe Peacock. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the next event in the SPIN series. SPIN is the Secrecy, Power and Ignorance Research Network. It's a multidisciplinary network spanning several institutions based in the southwest of the UK, made up of scholars at all levels and with a broad set of interests and expertise around understanding the power of unknowing. And you can find out more about SPIN. We're on Twitter and at secrecyresearch.com. The event series is funded by and co-hosted with the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership, and also supported by Migration Mobilities Bristol, which is a specialist research institute based at the University of Bristol, bringing together an interdisciplinary network of academics and others who engage with migration in theory, policy and practice. And today we're really excited to welcome Dr. Hannah Jones from the University of Warwick, who's going to speak about her book, Violent Ignorance. So I'll invite Hannah to speak in just a moment for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for some questions and kind of discussion before we wrap the event up at 3. You will have seen, I think, when you joined the event that we're recording today's session. So we'll record the talk and the Q&A, and then we'll make it available on the Southwest Doctoral Training Partnership website. So you can go back and watch it again afterwards if you'd like to. And also just to mention, the book's publishers have very kindly provided us with a discount code that gives you 20% off the book when you order it from bloomsbury.com. So I'll put that code and I think there's a flyer as well, which I'll put in the chat a little bit later in the session. But first, let me just introduce Hannah, who's our speaker today. Hannah's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Warwick, where she's worked since 2013, and her research interests focus on questions of racism, migration control and belonging, and on practices of policy making, critical and participative research methods and public sociology. Hannah's been a guest researcher at the University of Gothenburg and a visiting scholar at New York University, and has also worked at the Centre for Migration, Policy and Society at the University of Oxford and the Department of Social Policy and Criminology at the Open University. Hannah worked in London local government before completing her PhD in the Department of Sociology at Goldsmiths, and her first book, Negotiating Cohesion, Inequality and Change, Uncomfortable Positions in Local Government, won the 2014 British Sociological Association Philip Abrams Memorial Prize for Best First Book in UK Sociology. Hannah has also co-authored the book Go Home, The Politics of Immigration Controversies, and co-edited Stories of Cosmopolitan Belonging, Emotion and Location. And Hannah's latest book, which we'll hear about today, Violent Ignorance, was published in January 2021 and is about everyday ignorance and its violent consequences, focusing on historical and present questions of memory, migration and racism. Hannah is also working on collaborative projects on decolonialism and anti-racist student activism, and on the relationship between artistic practice and social research, and independently on research into genealogical and migratory imaginations that link Britain and Australia. Hannah, we're delighted to welcome you today. So I'll turn over to you now, and we'll have about 40 minutes to hear about the book, and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chloe. Let me share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can see the slides now, yeah? Yeah, good. Okay, so thank you. Oh.
Hannah, at the moment we can see your word.
Yes, sorry.
Slides, yeah, thanks.
That wasn't it, but yeah. Okay, so thanks for asking me to come, and thanks everyone for coming to listen. I'm going to talk about this book, Violent Ignorance, and some of the ideas within it. So in the book, I set out a phenomenon that I call violent ignorance, what it looks like, how it works, its consequences, and also possible ways to resist it. Put simply, what I mean by violent ignorance is a name for the action of turning away from painful knowledge and for the further violence that this can bring. The choice to ignore is not always a conscious or deliberate one, but it still matters. By ignoring violence, we can become implicated in that violence continuing. Often, the reason we find it painful to think about this violence is that we might realise that we are implicated, even if in a roundabout way. Now, most of the examples of violent ignorance that I've written about in the book are concerned with the construction of national and transnational histories belonging racism and migration control, as Chloe mentioned. Sometimes people express surprise that migration control and racism should be discussed together. But in many of the examples of violent ignorance I discuss, it becomes clear how they're linked because they operate in similar ways. Controlling who has access to a territory and the right to safety and dignity in a territory is a process of deciding who matters, based usually on where they were born, to whom they're related, or what material resources they have, or a combination of these. Racism comes in many forms, but it certainly includes enforcing differential access to dignity, safety, and resources based on where a person comes from, to whom they're related, and on what resources they can call. The failure to see the connections between racism, nationhood, and border control, even when those connections have been explicitly inscribed in law in many cases, is itself a form of violent ignorance. And the book tries to explore these ideas using a range of examples and different lenses to consider aspects of how violent ignorance works. These include the way that the murder of Joe Cox MP became so quickly integrated as a tragic personal loss of a wife and a mother, rather than being reckoned with as a political crisis which mapped onto a wider epidemic of misogynist and racist violence that responds to underlying unease and backlash against the growing prominence of women and feminists, people of colour, and anti-racists in public life. I also discussed the shock of the Grenfell fire in 2017, coming up to its 5th anniversary, and the attempts of those most affected to keep attention on the carelessness it exposed. Some of the discussion around the 5-year anniversary of that fire highlights how little action has taken place in the aftermath. I talk about the deliberate removing of historical documents from public memory by the British state during withdrawal from the colonies to hide histories of torture and genocide which were brought back into focus by survivors of the British war against the Mau Mau in Kenya. And I also tried to draw parallels of this with the destruction of files which would have demonstrated the rights of those affected by the Windrush scandal in recent years in the UK. I talk about attempts by those implicated in the violence of British immigration detention centres to take responsibility for their roles, and of other bystanders in situations of gross injustice, drawing on memories of descendants of Holocaust perpetrators. And I talk about efforts to use art as a means of developing meaningful and visceral understanding of the violence of border regimes in Europe and elsewhere. Now, if there's time, I'm happy to expand on any of those and their links to the focus of this talk in the question session we have afterwards. But today I'm going to focus on discussion about the ways in which violent ignorance, both the violence of ignoring and the ignoring of violence, is present in intimate family connections and personal identity, and how the practices of those reckoning with extreme family histories and what they choose to ignore or face up to can help us all to imagine ways of avoiding the enticement of violent ignorance more broadly. So I'm going to talk about Ben Affleck's family secrets. In 2014, Hollywood star Ben Affleck appeared on the popular US ancestry tracing television show Finding Your Roots. The broadcast episode included footage of Affleck discovering that his mother, Chris Bolt, had been an active civil rights campaigner in the 1960s. This fitted well with Affleck's well-documented interest in liberal social justice campaigns. But the following year, it became public that Affleck had chosen to follow only those branches of his family tree which fitted with his carefully sculpted public persona. When the entertainment company Sony had their emails hacked and they were released by WikiLeaks in 2015, the leak included an exchange about Affleck's episode between the Finding Your Roots presenter Henry Louis Gates Jr. and Sony Entertainment executive Michael Linton. Those emails made it clear that the search through Affleck's ancestors had also revealed that his great-great-great-grandfather, Benjamin Cole, had owned slaves. Affleck had asked that information not be included in the broadcast, and the company complied. An email from Linton suggested, "The big question is who knows that the material is in the documentary and is being taken out. I would take it out if no one knows. But if it gets out that you are editing the material based on this kind of sensitivity, then it gets tricky." And Gates replied that to do this would be a violation of PBS rules, actually, even for Batman, as Affleck was then Batman. Anyway, the edits were made despite that exchange. And Linton was correct, because once the emails were leaked that showed that Affleck had been trying to cover up his ancestors' exploitation, that cover-up became a much bigger news story than the original revelation might have been. In a public Facebook post after that revelation, Affleck insisted that he had asked for the changes the same way I lobby directors about what takes of mine I think they should use, and said this wasn't about covering up or privileged hiding of dirty secrets. "I didn't want any television show about my family to include a guy who owned slaves. I was embarrassed," he said in his Facebook statement. Affleck's statement emphasized that he wanted to distance himself from relatives who had profited from the slave trade, and concluded with the assertion that we deserve neither credit nor blame for our ancestors. But what angered people about this episode didn't appear to be that Affleck was descended from slave owners. In fact, it might be expected from a family history search among wealthy white Americans in a country that's built on dispossession of indigenous land, enslavement of people kidnapped from Africa and elsewhere. Work by historian Catherine Hall and her colleagues has shown that many ordinary people in Britain and elsewhere can find themselves to be descended from slave owners. Even the unspectacularly wealthy often held shares in other human beings than slaves. And Ben Affleck, like anyone else, has no control over who his ancestors are or what they did. And in that sense, no one was trying to blame him for his ancestors. The problem was his decision to ignore their history and what it might mean for his own life and his family's position in society. Though he says we deserve neither credit nor blame for our ancestors, his behaviour suggests he believed the opposite, or at least that he'd be given credit or blame for the ancestors he chose to remember. A civil rights activist in the family may indeed be something to be proud of, while a slave owner is not. But what does it mean to only remember the good and to forget or ignore the bad? In part, the problem with Affleck's actions was that they seemed hypocritical. If we deserve neither credit nor blame for our ancestors, then why associate oneself with the civil rights hero? The suspicion, of course, is Affleck was worried about public relations, that the association with a slave owner would tarnish his brand and cost him money. And he was in a position of power to stop that from happening. In doing so, he was also erasing the history of the people who were enslaved and exploited by his ancestor, who directly or indirectly contributed to Affleck's own wealth and power. So it's not to say that Affleck's revulsion and refusal of his ancestors' actions weren't real, or that he wasn't really revolted, or that it wasn't understandable for him to feel discomfort. Many other people choose particular branches of their family tree to remember or revere, whether because of internal feuds or romantic or associations or excitement, and others are ignored as less interesting or more shameful. The reason I'm dwelling on Ben Affleck's dilemma and decision is that it brings three things to light. Firstly, the immediate relevance of history to our present social reality. Secondly, the desire to hide from painful histories. And thirdly, the ways in which those ignored painful histories can and will rise up to haunt us in disruptive, violent ways, whether those are national histories or family ones. So Affleck's search was part of a wider popular interest in ancestry tracing. It's been boosted in recent decades by increasing ease of access to records through digitization of archives, online kinds of connection and sharing of information, for example, through ancestry.com on this slide and others, and also increasing use of DNA matching technologies to supplement historical record searches. Popular television shows like Who Do You Think You Are, which has versions in at least 18 countries, and Finding Your Roots, which Affleck appeared on, both spring from and encourage this trend. Academics fascinated by the ancestry tracing industry have asked what it means for people to do this. What does it mean to trace one's ancestry in this way? And many have found that an important part of the long-standing desire of people to find out who their ancestors were springs from a desire to understand their own identity and place in the world. So it follows that this desire in itself is one that recognizes, at least implicitly, that history is important in shaping our present. But what happens when that history reveals something uncomfortable about how we come to be who and where we are? This is essentially what happened to Affleck, and it's not uncommon. In research into family secrets using data from the UK Mass Observation Archive, sociologist Carol Smart found that many families have shared knowledge of their present and past that they choose to ignore and to avoid discussing. This might range from relatives being born outside of marriage to personal grievances over money. Whether these are secrets discovered through archival searches or from the more recent past and living memory, the desire to avoid thinking about that shared knowledge, to know while not knowing or to ignore, doesn't stop the influence or presence of those secrets. And this is what we might call haunting, following the work of sociologist Avery Gordon. The real ghosts that haunt us aren't made of ectoplasm. Gordon uses haunting to mean an animated state in which a repressed or unresolved social violence is making itself known, sometimes very directly, sometimes more obliquely. Gordon draws on psychoanalytical theory and argues that even what we cannot see can still determine our own desires and actions. I'd add that this isn't just a psychoanalytical effect, but it's a very material one. Ben Affleck's life, like anyone else's, has been determined by the social status, wealth, and power, or lack of them, that his ancestors had, and the interactions between those ancestors and the people around them. While Affleck chose to actively ignore his shameful and slave-owning family, that unresolved social violence made itself known first through the researchers on Finding Your Roots, and then more explosively through his attempt to repress this knowledge. As others have pointed out, there were other ways that Affleck could have approached this distasteful knowledge about his family in reparative rather than repressive ways. So, for example, actor Bill Paxton, who appeared on Who Do You Think You Are in 2015, also found he was descended from slave owners. But as a result, he chose to change the direction of the historical research and uncover and make known the history of one of the men who'd been enslaved by this ancestor. And in this approach, he recognized the wrongs of his ancestor without celebrating the connection, and instead sought in a minor way to repair that damage by understanding other histories that that man had been involved in and helped to erase. So here I want to build on the recognition, drawing on the work of Michel Rolfe-Triot, that violent ignorance is part of writing histories, that silencing is part of history, and that violent ignorance is an ongoing historical phenomenon, and use that to look at how consequences of violent ignorance resurface or haunt the present in more personal ways by focusing on the importance of family history and genealogy. So Ben Affleck's case, in his case, the hidden history which he found shameful was the history of the power that his ancestor had held as an oppressor of enslaved people. More commonly, oppressor histories are remembered and celebrated, even if their violence might become less emphasized in the retelling. If you think about statues of men who slaughtered thousands that stand in public squares around the world, or grand buildings of state and industry built on the back of enslaved populations through sugar, tobacco, and slavery, that make up the grandeur of cities like Liverpool, Bristol, Marseille, or Lisbon. The histories that tend to be forgotten or hidden are those that were deliberately erased as unworthy. As I discussed that elsewhere in the book. As I mentioned, there's very specific and explicit examples around destroyed records about the British occupation of Kenya and elsewhere. In more personal terms, individuals and families who've been convinced that their histories are shameful tend not to be those whose ancestors did something to hurt others, but who were stigmatized and mistreated by others. So, for example, Indigenous people robbed of their pasts, enslaved people forcibly transported around the world, or families separated by institutions as a result of abject poverty. When that shame resurfaces, are there ways of reclaiming that haunting as resistance? So, as I said, there might be a simplicity in agreeing with Ben Affleck that we deserve neither credit nor blame for our ancestors. But the experience of many people is that ancestors have meaning and give meaning to their own lives. Even where that's not the case, or for people who don't know or have no interest in their lives of their ancestors, their inheritance, whether that's wealth or genetics, social status or norms, does shape people's lives. So what does it mean to look to one's ancestors for explanations of one's own life when doing so reveals the ways that racialization and national exclusions enabled or disabled their flourishing or the flourishing of others? Even if we're not deserving of credit or blame for our ancestors, should we take responsibility for them? And what would that look like? So the question might seem quite different for those who identify victims in their history and those who identify perpetrators or bystanders. But is it different? And what about those of us who might be descended from both victim and perpetrator? I think someone's unmuted. Discussing how people come to terms with their family past can keep coming back to this question about, does it matter? Does it matter if we cannot see the relevance of those histories? And does it matter if we do not confront them? And how can we confront them and break through that veil of violent ignorance? So while family history research often begins as a hobby or an idle interest, for others it can be a quest to track down a family legend or a desire to provide information for children or grandchildren about origins. And this quest often leads amateur genealogists to find particular affinities with some parts of the family tree or particular figures, and then to start to construct their own narratives of the connection between their characteristics or the characteristics of relatives in living memory and the connection with those long-lost ancestors. Those stories are often benign and can feel reassuring of one's place in the world, much like feeling of belonging to a nation and its most proud version of history might feel reassuring and benign. And with the growth of DNA technology and matching services, the amateur genealogist is no longer limited to the dusty records when searching for familial connections. There are many services which offer to tell a person the percentage of different ethnicities in their blood and to seek matches with other people who have had DNA tests and added them to the database. The geographic matching algorithms are questionable on many levels and have been criticised for their reliance on partial measurement and reification of racialised categories as if fixed. But nevertheless, many people take those results very seriously and again can use them to reassess their own sense of identity and place in the world. The researchers Wendy Roth and Bjorn Ivemark interviewed citizens who'd received DNA test results for ethnicity and found that many of them sought to incorporate this previously unknown heritage into their identities in varying ways. That included adopting a new ethnic or racial identity in how they described themselves, learning new languages, or dressing in the style of their newly discovered ancestors. Others, however, rejected test results which didn't conform to their expectations or hopes about who they were or had been. And these ancestral discoveries are different, I think, to uncovering or resisting violent ignorance. In some cases, they reproduce a different kind of ignorance or refusal of uncomfortable knowledge. And this could be seen, for example, in the row over the US Democratic Senator and potential presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren's claim to Indigenous American ancestry. While her intention in publicising her DNA finding that between 1/64th and 1/1024th of her ancestry was Native American was variously characterised as an attempt at solidarity and recognition or at political opportunism, some Indigenous scholars took a different perspective. Anthropologist Kim Tolbear explained that Warren's claims centre measures conducted and controlled by mainly settler-owned DNA testing companies and don't take into account the self-definition and self-government of the Cherokee Nation, to which Warren claims belonging. Tolbear writes that tribal governments establish regulations that do not use genetic ancestry tests for other forms of biological and political relationships to define our citizenries. Warren's identification, while maybe meant as an act of solidarity and recognition, played out instead as a colonial claiming of the right to an identity based in an ignorance of that identity. So we might think of this as an instance of whiteness as a form of property, identified and expanded on by scholars such as Cheryl Harris and Aileen Morton Robinson. Thinking about whiteness as ownership or entitlement to ownership of people, property, or rights allows us to also see how this white entitlement can also encompass the expectation of taking on minority identities as property, or as accessories that can be picked up and put down, rather than as experience and belonging. Whereas Elizabeth Warren or the people in Roth and Ivemak's study were interested in exploring racialized parts of their identity that they never knew existed, the motivations appear as if they're all about the present, rather than about understanding the histories that produced this present. Taking ancestry as an outcome, rather than as a process, is a form of violent ignorance that erases social interactions and meanings, and instead takes on a shallow presentism about meanings of belonging. Rather than being haunted, this type of approach seems like the cheap thrill of a ghost town fairground ride. But different images or promptings can prick or pierce the learned ignorance of different people in different ways. We notice different resonances because we have those different histories, awarenesses, interests. But these noticings or punctures are real moments that have power, consequence, and histories of their own, and futures that they might put in motion. These moments are important because they seem ineffable or silent, because some people can ignore a moment which others can't look away from. In September 2015, journalists reported refugees being crammed onto trains at the Hungarian border, told they were heading to Austria and Germany, then finding themselves instead deposited at a Hungarian migrant reception centre. Some refused to disembark from the trains, others were pictured lying across the tracks in protest. This was reported widely as just another event in the tragedy of what was that summer termed the European migrant crisis. For me, the images of the crowded train redirected by officials bit into my awareness in a particularly visceral way. It was partly the mirroring of how trains were used, including in that specific part of Europe, as tools in the Nazi genocide. It was also a specific personal link I felt as the granddaughter of a German Jew who escaped on a passenger train in 1938. He was a worried 12-year-old, angry to be leaving his home, kept in check by his parents, who were fearful their journey out of Nuremberg might be halted. This heritage is a troubling one to interpret. Not only did my immediate family survive and thrive, but German laws on reparations to the descendants of those denied German citizenship mean I've been able to gain dual UK-German citizenship now and stay in the EU after Brexit, so lucky me. But what I'm most interested in here is the bringing together of the question of haunting and the question of violent ignorance. Is it possible that we can draw on the memories of and discuss older examples of violent ignorance to mobilize recognition of violent ignorance in the present and counter it? Could resonances with how previous generations initially ignored genocides and refugees and the consequences of that ignorance be a spur to action now? Marian Hirsch, a scholar of literature, coined the term post-memory and post-generation to talk about ways in which the trauma of the European Holocaust of the 20th century has woven itself into the lives of children, grandchildren, and other descendants of survivors. The post-trauma of those who are not survivors, but descendants of survivors of trauma is a controversial topic, and in particular, a large portion of this post-generation are in many ways socially privileged. Jewishness isn't always equated to whiteness, but the entitlements of whiteness are accessed by many of Jewish descent. Children of Holocaust survivors may well have lost large swathes of family, kin, and friends, and the consequences of this for their childhood may have been severe. Though they were survivors, forced immigration is not a small matter. There are things to make sense of and traumas to overcome, but can this be related to the present? Is it a co-opting of ancestral trauma, a dwelling in the past? How can those understandings and experiences be honoured and respected in the present in relation to our current situation rather than an inherited one? Cultural historian Saidiya Hartman's engagement with the legacies and reverberations of the transatlantic slave trade and the ways in which descendants of slaves attempt to commemorate and come to terms with ancestral trauma can be useful here. In relation to people attempting to understand the impact of unspeakable crimes committed against their ancestors, Hartman asks, can we mourn for those lost without assuming and usurping the place of the dead, and yet recognise that the injuries of racism tether us to this past? Does mourning necessarily entail the obliteration of the other through identification? Can we mourn the dead without becoming them? These questions in relation to how to deal with being a descendant of enslaved people are relevant to the discussion of Holocaust post-trauma, but they also relate to coming to terms with being descended from perpetrators of such crimes. The tendency to see remembering of these pasts as a question of identification with one's ancestors leads directly to refusal, such as Ben Affleck's, an insistence that one is not responsible for the actions of the past and a refusal to know that past. Hartman's questions are about the dangers of present generations overwriting the lives of their ancestors by claiming those past traumas as their own, and through this re-signifying, losing the actual meaning and truth of those who suffered. She suggests instead that current generations seek ways to mourn those traumas, to recognise the present but different traumas that stem from them, and in doing so to neither ignore the past nor reinvent it. Again, this isn't simply about remembering, but about thinking and questioning. A further provocation from Hartman helps to make this explicit. She asks, can monumentalising the past suffice in preventing atrocity? Or does it only succeed in framing these crimes against humanity from the vantage point of contemporary progress and reason, turning history into one great museum in which we revel in antiquarian excess? Here, Hartman is questioning whether the memorialising of the slave trade in itself is enough of a reminder to prevent such horrors occurring again. As with the Holocaust and with other wars and conflicts, many feel the imperative that never again must this happen might be better secured by ensuring subsequent generations are aware of the scale of these atrocities. So we might think that public memorials, museums, education programs dedicated to the memory of the Holocaust, the transatlantic slave trade, and other terrible crimes of human history are straightforwardly part of a project to combat violent ignorance, in the sense that such memorials counter ignorance of violence with the aim of preventing future violence. But Hartman's questions point to the risk that even such important projects can be sealed over with a film of violent ignorance, as if they're treated as preserving such histories in amber, artifacts from the past, rather than living history which reaches into our present and future. The question for those considering their entanglement with perpetrators is differently nuanced. For them, the question is not about honouring one's ancestors, but learning from and understanding what they did and how those deeds relate to the present. Making such pasts felt in the present is unsettling, not least when they're already very close. While Ben Affleck's great-great-great-grandfather was safely hidden in generations past until the TV programme researchers uncovered him, for the children of genocidal criminals, the pain of understanding how one's parents could be loved, or at least be the people who made you, while also being inhumane monsters, could be the ultimate test of how to embrace or challenge violent ignorance. Feminist researcher Suzanne Luhmann has spent much time examining how the children and grandchildren of Nazi leaders past. Sorry, can you hear me again? So Luhmann notes that memoirs of them, descendants of perpetrators, by their very nature, can rarely bear to acknowledge the entire extent to which beloved family members were perpetrators and the extent to which members of the extended family supported and sympathised with them. Sometimes this can reach the extent of children of Nazi perpetrators presenting themselves as victims of the perpetrator father, tending to erase the identity of the real Nazi victims, particularly when the story of the crimes is eclipsed by the focus on the familial struggles of the narrator in some accounts. Discussing a memoir by Margaret Nissen, the daughter of Albert Speer, a Nazi armament minister, architect, and close ally of Hitler, who was involved in the exploitation of forced labourers and concentration camp prisoners. Luhmann notes Nissen's description of how she did not want to know the specific details of what her father did, and to maintain such a position of intentional ignorance throughout her adult life takes extraordinary effort. And this was especially so because Nissen spent over a decade working as a photographer in a memorial museum, meaning she had to reproduce images of Nazi violence and would come across images of herself as a child with her father in the archive. Luhmann draws attention to how Nissen would work with the photographs but refused to engage with them and would actively unknow. Nissen says, "I took them, enlarged them, saw them and did not look at them. I did not want to think about the images. I wanted to avoid being confronted with things for which my father may have been responsible or of which he had possibly known." While Luhmann notes Nissen's struggle and desire to understand how her life could have turned out normally despite her father's terrible past, the answer to this question, Luhmann argues, is that Nissen was able to be normal by ignoring or refusing to know the details of what her father did. Her life's normalcy is a product not just of ignorance or of not knowing. Normalcy springs from the refusal or the will to not know. What must be emphasized here is that Nissen's refusal to know about her father's crimes is almost masked by her endeavor of writing a book about him, but the book was about her relationship to him. While she seems to be looking at and attempting to understand her family history, the way it's approached remains a sealing up of violent ignorance at its heart as the actual crimes are kept out of view. So does this understandable desire not to know about horrible crimes by one's parents amount to violent ignorance, or is it just ignorance? That is, what's the violence that's reproduced by refusing that knowledge? While internally families may suffer trauma and misery from repressing the knowledge of parents' crimes, the social consequences of the forgetting and ignoring of family perpetrator histories can also be violent and dangerous. If one is unable to understand rather than just remember what happened, then how and why is one to avoid its recurrence? This is what preoccupies another descendant of a Nazi leader who's made it his life's work to examine and atone for what his father did. Nicholas Frank is the son of Hans Frank, who was the head of the German government of occupied Poland during the Second World War, overseeing mass murder and extermination camps, accused of the execution of 200,000 Poles, the transfer of hundreds of thousands more to Germany, and the creation of the ghetto. In 1987, Nicholas Frank published a memoir about his father called In the Shadow of the Reich. And in more recent years, he was interviewed by the lawyer and author Philippe Sands for Sands' memoir. Sands found Frank to be kindly, gentle, but also steely, with his own temperament and agenda. In recent years, Frank has publicly compared the policies and rhetoric of the AfD, the far-right political party gaining ground in German elections, to that of the Nazi leadership, including his father. This includes a widely circulated essay in the German newspaper Der Spiegel, which says in its title on the slide, "Son of a Nazi war criminal on AfD rhetoric, that's my father talking." Nicholas Frank straightforwardly argues that lessons of the past must be learnt by recognising the parallel and warning signs when they re-emerge in the present. And he takes on this task of reminding people as a mission that is his because of the crimes of his father. Now, Jennifer Teager has a slightly different story, but one that still fits within much of the pattern of memoir by descendants of Nazi perpetrators and the resurfacing of ignored violent histories in the present. She was born in Germany in 1970. Her maternal grandparents were Edmund Goeth, the man who constructed and ran the Krakow-Plaszow concentration camp, killing and torturing thousands of people, and Ruth Irina Goeth, who lived there in luxury with him during that time. Teager's mother, Monica Goeth, took her to a Catholic orphanage and put her in the care of the nuns, from where she was adopted. Despite her adoption, Jennifer stayed in touch with Monica and Irina until she was 21. Teager only met her biological father when she was 28. He was Nigerian, meaning Teager herself is both an Afro-German and a descendant of Nazis, hence the title of the memoir she wrote on discovering her family history, "My Grandfather Would Have Shot Me." Though Teager maintained contact with her biological mother and grandmother throughout her childhood, she didn't know the reality of her grandfather's past until she happened to come across a book in the library at the age of 38. The book was a biography of Monica Girth, her mother. It was published in 2002 entitled, I Have to Love My Father, Don't I? It was concerned with Monica's relationship with Eamon Girth. And this discovery shattered Tiga, partly because it pointed to the knowledge and involvement of her grandmother, Irena, with whom she had maintained a warm relationship, even in foster care and adoption. The process of dealing and coming to terms with this is the subject of Tiga's own memoir. Part of Tiga's story is about coming to terms with her beloved grandmother's continued involvement with such a man. She seems to be able to come up to a conclusion that perhaps a human can be many things that's not just good or bad in a more sophisticated way than some of the other descendants. She writes, my mother was very liberal for her time. My grandmother was very liberal for her time. For a while, she shared her flat with a transvestite called Lulu and went out in the town with him and his gay friends. My parents met when one of my father's friends, also African, was living as a lodger in my grandmother's house. Having an African man living in your house was far from normal in Munich in the 1960s and 70s. She was no racist. Likewise, Tiga argues that the guilt of the parents must be distinguished from the lives of their descendants. She disagrees with the decision of Bettina Goering, a great niece of Hitler's chief of the Luftwaffe, to be sterilized so that she would not create another monster, not produce any more Goerings. For Tiga, this sends the wrong message. There is no Nazi gene. Tiga's story is not simply one of the eruption of understanding oneself was descended from and having loved someone implicated in terrible horrors. She also has a more complicated story of aligning her understanding of herself and family through the process of adoption, the relationship between the family that brought her up and the family into which she was born. In some ways, we might consider this to account, at least in part, for her rejection of the idea of a Nazi gene, knowing that families, relationships, and identity are more than biology. But on the other hand, many people who have been adopted, as with Tiga herself, still find knowledge of their birth family and biological connections to be fundamentally meaningful to their sense of self. Another complication with Tiga's life is her racialization as Black within white German society. All of her family she knew growing up, both adoptive and biological, were white. And she describes being accustomed to being treated with amazement when revealing her German identity. Perhaps it's in part this cacophony of meanings and ambiguities that enable Tiga to reach a position in which she can neither ignore nor embrace her grandparents and their deeds, but can sit with their contradictions, as she writes. None of this means that I agree with what my grandmother did or that I want to cover for her. I renounce what she did and sadly didn't do in the camp. I renounce her explanations. I simply distinguish between the public figure and my grandmother. My grandfather did not repent in the end. Why else would he have raised his arm in a Hitler salute at the gallows? My grandmother never really repented either. She never really saw the victim. She walked through life with her eyes closed. Nonetheless, I still feel close to my grandmother. I will not try to justify this fact. I won't explain it either. That's just the way it is. As with Affleck's resistance to being associated with a slave-owning ancestor, wanting to distance oneself from violence is of course understandable, even laudable. But to be politically effective and valuable, this distancing needs to be understood as a desire and an ongoing process rather than a fact. To engage in that distancing from evil as a process, it's necessary to recognise the different ways in which we might still be connected to that oppressive violence and even benefit from it in order to work on overturning that. But to do so, of course, is a painful thing to attempt. And what about my claim to recognition of resonances between the violence of the border crisis in Hungary and throughout Europe and the horrors of Nazi deportation trains? Is it really correct to say I noticed that because I know part of my family history is tied up with that escape from Nazi Europe? For most of my life, I've resisted claiming my ancestry as an explanation for what I care about. Of course, there are other equally valid versions of my family history that could be told of different parental, grandparental, and ancestral trajectories than my own. And being an exile and refugee was not something my grandpa talked about to us or to my mum, or as far as I know, to his other children. But I did take German citizenship, and that wasn't something I never considered or known I was eligible for until the aftermath of the referendum to leave the EU in 2016. In the atmosphere of intolerance and anxiety that surged with that campaign and has only increased since, the internet suddenly swarmed with people exchanging ideas for holding on to EU citizenship. and among them I noticed the restoration of citizenship process. This was a rule introduced into the German constitution in 1949 as a form of reparation for the crimes of the Nazi government. Any German citizen whose nationality had been removed by the Nazis was entitled to restitution of citizenship, and so were their descendants. There were various motivations reported for people doing this, but mine was really one of anxiety. Even as I felt it realistically unlikely that I would have to leave the UK, the opportunity for a backup plan did seem important. Relatedly, it seemed wise to play the border regime at its own game to gather as many nationalities as possible. But this desire, no matter how rooted in anxiety and family history, remains one of privilege. I now have two of the most powerful passports in the world. And at the same time, increasingly national governments are targeting dual nationals to make them more precarious, since one nationality can be removed without breaking international conventions about making such a person stateless. And that's, of course, being used in racialized ways in Britain in ongoing and developing laws around nationality. In the case of reckoning with my relationship to family history, it's certainly not a question of credit or blame for ancestors rejected by Ben Affleck. What this encounter with the eruption of seething absences and muted presences is around the national schism of Brexit is a demonstration that the past remains alive, but neither the present nor the past is clearly divided between victim and perpetrator, good and bad, innocent or implicated. It's also a reminder of how blurred and intertwined allegiance and belonging to both family and nation can be. I'll finish there because we don't have time.
Thank you so much, Hannah, for a really fascinating and wide-ranging talk, actually. And I think it kind of gives a sense of how wide-ranging your book is in terms of the kind of issues that you cover, and also I think just an idea of how powerfully and beautifully written it is as well. So we've got about just over 10 minutes for some discussion. So if anyone would like to ask a question, please do either put it in the chat or signal that you want to speak and ask a question that way. I'll give you a minute to kind of to get your thoughts together, and if anyone's ready to ask a question, give us a wave or put it in the chat. Otherwise, I'll take the opportunity to ask a quick question myself. Elspeth, can you unmute yourself, Elspeth, or do you need? You can, great.
Yeah, no, hi, Hannah. Thanks so much for that brilliant introduction to this interesting set of questions. So my question is about, I think I'm really drawn to this tension, or this ethical moment of when we remember and when we forget, when we pay attention and when we don't. And I was wondering where you sit now on that. Are there specific, sorry, my internet connection is a little rubbish, so apologies if I break out. Are there, like, where do you sit? Or who do you turn to most for their wisdom on that particular ethical conundrum? Sorry, if that's a big question. So maybe Chloe has a slightly softer one.
I'll try and answer it. Yeah, I think it's actually, yeah, it's exhausting. It was exhausting to write that book, and we've all been exhausted in all different ways over the last few years. And I think I did try to take account of that in the book, and to sort of say that, to try to not be hectoring and sanctimonious about we must all pay attention, but to recognize the power of that, and that there are moments when attention can be used and taken forward, or even though it's more comfortable to simplify. And I guess, who do I look to? I'm probably going to kick myself for forgetting people. That's why I put the face. But I think Les Back is really kind of inspirational as a sociologist who writes about paying attention and trying to understand the complexity of things in a careful and a slow way, but one that responds to what's happening. And I think it's that the bit that I would push on is also intervening, I guess, which takes a bit more courage and energy and risk as well. I'll think about that more. If I come up with something in the next 10 minutes, I'll let you know. Chloe, did you?
Yeah, okay, good. I'll jump in. Nassar, I'll just ask a quick question, if that's okay, and then I'll come to you. I just wondered if you could say a little bit, Hannah, about where this idea of violent ignorance came from, and if there was a particular kind of moment or event that kind of prompted you to think about ignorance in this way and to think about the kind of violent implicit in it.
Yeah, I think it came from a few things, but I think the key starting point was maybe around Jo Cox's assassination, which I mentioned very briefly, and which is kind of how I opened the book as well. Not, that was a horrible thing. The person was killed, and she was killed by someone who was expressly killing her because of his white supremacist, misogynist beliefs and actions, not though she was a white woman and so on. But the point was the response to it was what I was trying to work through. Not people were upset, but it became about a wife and mother, a kind person, a young woman, and the response that we have more in common than what divides us isn't, again, like a nice and laudable thing, but it seemed to not engage with the fact that a politician had been murdered. Not just a politician had been murdered in an expressly political way, but in the week before this massive referendum, in a way that was tied to that by the person who did it. And it was not discussed as it's still not really in the political culture as a shocking moment, a turning point, meaning anything really, apart from that MPs experience violence. So I was trying to kind of think through why and how, and trying to be careful around not criticizing people for wanting to have more in common and be together. But actually, I think that's problematic because it ignored the root causes of what happened there, and in some ways makes it worse.
Thanks, Hannah. Okay, Nassar, would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much, Hannah. Thanks, Chloe. Really looking forward to reading the book. It sounds wonderful and just really important, and kind of following up some of the arguments that you signaled here. So one thought I had whilst you're speaking was, do you in the book discuss the ways in which some memories of trauma are almost kind of appropriated in terms of the formal narration of things like national identity or indeed other ways of common membership that, paradoxically are to some extent re-traumatizing or bordering in a way in which it excludes others, not just in an instrumental way, but then that tension within it and how people who still bear those intergenerational traumatic memories want to resist that. And so there's an unsettled nature to it, which means that it's a very live, almost dispute rather than being something which has happened in the past.
Yeah, I think it's something I probably want to explore more in terms of wanting to develop this particular part of the work around family, nation and race, and that kind of comfort in belonging and the division that's inherent in that. So I think that's in the book in the background, but I think the main area that ties in with that is the Jo Cox work, and we have more in common than what divides us. We are which it was a response to the murder and this kind of rupture of democracy, if like, but was also about saying, oh, we all get along. We all like, there were videos made about we all like eating toast. British people all like eating toast, whether they're British or not. And that was like fine. But it doesn't address the fact that some people want to kill each other and we don't all want to go to the picnic together. So I think it does need, I think there's a bit more development of this around kind of, I think you're talking about kind of foundational national memories and the kind of, Second World War or in this place, but also others. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks. And Bridget.
Hi. Thanks for that, Hannah. That was really a bit mind-blowing. So I kind of I sort of feel like my question is probably a bit vague, but because I'll need a little bit of time to think it through. But do you think there's a danger that this kind of, thinking about, people's ancestors and kind of, honestly, I've got a brain like a fish. Ben Affleck, that's right. That example that you give. I mean, is there a danger that we kind of really are risk reinforcing a kind of an individualistic politics of blame, and kind of in a way made even worse because of its connotations with blood and ancestry? Because we don't have to be Nazis to have benefited from Nazi Germany. We don't have to have been kind of, our ancestors don't have to have been slave owners in order to have benefited from slavery, but sometimes that's how it feels. And actually there are lots of ways in which, in wealthy countries, we have collectively benefited from the colonial past, whatever our ancestries. So I just sort of kind of, I don't know. I just wondered what you thought of that and what the kind of politics, like, is there a risk? Like, what are the politics that kind of emerge from this kind of analysis, I suppose?
Yeah, thank you, Bridget. I know, I see what you mean. I think I see what you mean. I think with Ben Affleck, I felt like it was okay to pick on Ben Affleck because he's a film star. And I think there's some tension between trying to tell a story that's legible, because I was trying to write this book for a broader audience as well, and to try and tell a legible story, and to actually end up going into those pitfalls that I'm trying to unpick of individualizing and fixing. So I guess what I was trying to talk about was not that he should be in trouble for having had family who were slave owners or not. In fact, as you say, it's not, lots of other people can benefit depending who your family history is, but the interest in people attaching these meanings to particular moments from history, potential and meaning, and then choosing to attach meanings to some and not others. So everyday family history researchers look, we had this sailor who went around the world, or we had this exotic princess who, and that's how I know that I am, why I'm really good at dancing or something, which I didn't know before. But that, so we do tell those stories to ourselves, and lots of people do that. It's a human thing. And then the loadedness of the politics of this, and that the move from wanting to position oneself, he wanted to position himself with the civil rights activism, but not with the slave ownership. And what does that do? So, because it's not saying that we deserve no credit or blame for our ancestors. It's saying we deserve credit for the ones we like, but we can't be to blame. And I think I'm trying to think of another way of approaching that, which might be taking responsibility for where we are and how we are, not to take responsibility because your great-great-grandfather did something, you should make reparations, but as that other way of making meaning about how we are and where we are. I don't know how I'll think about that some more, but I think the question was really about how can that allegory of Ben Affleck choosing which story is meaningful be a way of thinking, how else could we approach this? And that there's lots and lots of work on survivors of the Holocaust and descendants of perpetrators of the Holocaust. There's a huge field of that, so that is a way into those stories as well. And people trying to understand why it matters who their family were or where it doesn't matter. But then maybe to break that down. Does that address what you were saying, or am I rambling?
No,
Sorry.
you're not rambling at all, but I just really, I really, it'd be really good to kind of like really I'd really like to have a longer conversation, because I think it's really important. I think this kind of work is actually like how we relate to our histories and which histories we are allowed to claim, because we're not allowed to claim, you know, it's actually, so the histories that you're allowed to claim are actually often to do with ideas of blood.
Yeah.
So, you know, how do we actually feel about, like, if you are comfortable with the idea of blood, then, you know, how would you speak back, for example, to the Cherokee person? Like, I can't, anyway, so just to say that I think there's loads of really interesting things to talk about here. So thanks very much. I'm going to get the book.
Thank you.
I think there's obviously loads more to talk about here. I just want to say that it is 3 o'clock. So for those of you who need to get to other meetings or get to the next thing, thank you so much for coming. If, Hannah, you're happy to just stay on for a few more minutes, there are a couple of other questions, and it would be great if we can just have a few minutes more chat for those who can stay on. But for those of you who are heading off, thank you very much. Rebecca, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, Hannah, I mean, I don't know how to phrase this into a question, because it's just sparked off so many thoughts. There's so much I'd like to discuss with you. But yeah, it's kind of about the different responses to historic violence, really. And I think it's interesting to me on a personal level, because I also have ancestors from Nazi Germany, and but my mother was from East Prussia, which is the part of Germany which is now Russia, and so fled the Russians rather than the Nazis, and yeah, and so not part of the sort of German guilt, because it wasn't German. So yeah, because she was fleeing she was fleeing the Russians. It's not a reason to get dual. I've also tried to get dual citizenship, but I'm not entitled to it. So I think that's interesting. But also I find it interesting about how some of the people who I know, so some sort of people who I know through my mother, East Prussians, who their response is about trying to reclaim that territory, as if there's through blood you've got an entitlement to something from there, which sort of contrasts with the other. So for my mum, it was much more about befriending the people who then went to live there, and how we can learn and make sure that these things don't happen again. But yeah, this is very much thinking about what the questions are. But one of the things that I find really interesting in this is how in Germany the memory of Nazi Germany is very much, it's very pervasive, and which I think is brilliant in terms, it's much better than in Britain, where there isn't that memory or guilt at basically crimes from history. But I wonder to what extent that excludes some forms of violence, like ongoing violence. So in Germany, I've found it quite sort of uncomfortable how you can see homeless people sleeping on the street in the winter right next to the Stolpersteine, so the memories of where Jewish people were killed in Nazi Germany. So that kind of the guilt of Nazi Germany, like sometimes I think, is that overshadowing the guilt that should be, or the action that should be happening now for the ongoing violence? I don't know, sorry, that's really rambling. It's basically saying I thought that was really interesting and I'd love to carry on talking about it with you.
Thanks, Rebecca. Yeah, I think that's something I'm trying to get at as well. Like, that a form of violent ignorance, I called it violent ignorance, you could call it something else, but a form of this thing is finding a thing to care about and then not needing to care about anything else. So, and that keeping that, and then at some moments we see that different moments for different people, but there are some collective moments of seeing things that we all knew were going on, but having to care. Like the Grenfell Tower, for many people was a moment that you might have known all about housing inequality, you might have known all about kind of institutional indifference, you might have known all about the kind of racialized ways that intersect with poverty and borders, but that avoidable tragedy made people care for a minute, or stand there and look, but then what? And then, or the same with the 2015 kind of refugees welcome movement, and what's happening right now I can't talk about, but there's something going on now as well. But the refugees welcome movement, that people suddenly did want to, or said, or were able to say, like, we want to help refugees in the UK and many other countries. And then David Cameron said, okay, we'll let in 20,000 Syrians at some point, and that just was done. So I think the same thing with, like, there's a kind of dealing with things as if they can be finished and dealt with. As humans, we kind of need to have, I think, fundamentally, I don't know, in language, we have to communicate through language, we have to have some lines around what we're saying, but at the same time, how do you keep that open to change and to be able to see that we've built a memorial, but that's not the end of reckoning with history or reckoning with processes that go on. And so so I guess that's where I would come in. I don't know. But thank you.
Thanks, Hannah. There's one more question in the chat, but I feel like it might be quite a big one. Martin was talking about the role of the family in kind of memory making and meaning making. Martin's question is, where does this leave us on the family as a social phenomenon? Is it something which needs to be unmade, resisted, reimagined, or might it be a locus for resistance and justice? I don't know if you've got any kind of quick thoughts about that you want to share.
Yes, I know. I think that's what I'm trying to figure out now. I think that's where I want to develop some of this work, which is why I wanted to talk about that chapter. And it speaks to kind of what NASA and Bridget were asking as well. I think the kind of that family is there's lots of work obviously on family as a helpful institution, family as a destructive institution, but I think the parallels and the connections, not just parallels, but connections in it between how family and nation work and how race works are important to look at, because the three co-constitute one another, and the answer might not be that they're all wrong. Well, they probably are all wrong, but family is one that's harder to say is completely wrong. So where do we go from there? That's really the question. I think it probably needs to be all those things, resisted, reimagined, unmade, and so on. But I don't know the answer. Sorry.
No, that's great, and it sounds like it's kind of something that you're going to continue working on. So it'll be great to kind of see where that goes over the coming years. Okay, Elspeth, did you want to?
Yeah, just to follow on that and just say, I think that this line of discussion is exactly some of the things that we're talking about through SPIN, and I would love for the opportunity to carry on. I know that Owen's doing work on that. Bridget, it sounds like we've got some overlapping interests in Hannah and Nasser, because we're trying to understand the structural dimensions of all this and how we can move away from the individual, but of course how the individual fits in and precisely what you've just said, co-constitutes with, the nation, the national, and race and gender and sexuality, and how all these things work together. And it brings me back to that question about the ethics of this. Where do we end up when we're trying to decide about, forgetting versus remembering, and ignorance versus knowing, and things like that. Anyways, sorry, I didn't mean to hog the floor. I thought I would just say that there's certainly a line of discussion that I'd be very happy to support exploring a bit further if people are interested.
Great. Thank you, Elspeth. Yeah, no, I think that's really useful. And I think it's really good to know that this has been a really a really kind of fruitful connection to make, and it sounds like, yeah, Hannah's work has got lots to say to the work that lots of us are doing. So it will be an ongoing conversation, so we can think about how to kind of, yeah, keep the dialogue going and do something else in the coming months. But yeah, it's been a really, really interesting talk, and thanks everyone for your really thoughtful questions as well. Thanks so much, Hannah, again for your time, and thanks everyone for coming. See you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks everyone.
Thank you, Hannah. Thanks so much. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you.